once part of the private sector are transformed to a public good, it is often contentious and matters opposition. The income that once belonged to shareholders now belongs to the government. In most cases, ownership extends to managerial and directorial control as well. The key outcome of nationalization is the redirection of revenues to the country's government instead of private operators who may export funds with no benefit to the host country. You see, there's an important point there where the nationalization basically it helps with the redirection of revenues to the country's government instead of private operators who may export funds with the host country not benefiting. And then how it works, the nationalization process often happens in smaller countries when governments wish to seize control of a profitable industry in order to create a sizable income stream for the government. It allows for a larger cut of the profits than simple taxation does in an industry that may be central to the economy, such as the energy sector. And then compensation. I know compensation is it's a huge topic when we talk about, land redistribution, land return. When you talk about nationalization, compensation is a huge part of that conversation. So since nationalized industries are state-owned, the government is responsible for meeting any debts. The nationalized industries do not normally borrow from the domestic market other than for short-term borrowing. If they are profitable, the profit is often used to finance other state services such as social programs and government research, which cannot lower the tax burden. The traditional Western stance on compensation was expressed by United States Secretary of State Cordell Hull during the Mexican nationalization of the petroleum industry in 1938, saying that compensation should be prompt, effective, and adequate. According to this view, the nationalizing state is obliged under international law to pay the deprived party the full value of the property taken. The opposition has been taken mainly by developing countries, claiming that the question of compensation should be left entirely up to the sovereign state. So guys, there's something to consider as well, international law of compensation, because remember, the South African Constitution, it's in alignment with international law. So when you're thinking expropriation, and compensation, nationalization and compensation, or without compensation, or all of those different dynamics, you have to consider international law because we're not dealing with all these different matters in our society. We need to make sure that every process is done accordingly, with different aspects being taken into account, different laws, procedures, and resolutions being taken into account. And speaking of resolutions, let us carry on reading. In 1962, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 1803, permanent sovereignty over national resources, which states that in the event of nationalization, the owner shall be paid appropriate compensation in accordance with international law. In doing so, the UN rejected the traditional Calvo doctrinal view and the communist view. The term appropriate compensation represents a compromise between the traditional views, taking into account the need of developing countries to pursue reform even without the ability to pay full compensation, and the Western concern for the protection of private property. So you can see that you can see that that there's international resolutions that you need to consider as well. And I know when it comes to compensation, the people of South Africa, here in South Africa at home, I know there is a view that when you nationalize, you must do it without compensation. When you do land distribution, it must be without compensation, And basically, I want you guys to consider as well, as we're dealing with expropriation, we're following the process that need to be done for expropriation needs to happen. I'm in full support of land expropriation. I'm in full support, of nationalization. And now, but the process that need to be followed, and there are different things that you need to consider as well, even internationally as well, because the international, the international, considerations when we're dealing with these things. That's something which a lot of people don't realize, that whenever we're dealing with expropriation, whenever we're dealing with nationalization, there's all the international interests, international things that we need to consider as we're fast tracking these processes. So that's what you must consider as well. I mentioned renationalization. Let us continue. Let us carry on. I mentioned what is renationalization. And then, okay, fine. Economic analysis. A 2018 Stanford study of Chinese firms found their state-owned enterprises to be significantly more productive. In 2019, research based on studies from Greenwich University found that the nationalization of key services such as water, bus, railways, and broadband could save 13 billion every year. In more recent times, the failure of major banks has highlighted the fact that under national ownership and control, failing banks can be funded more quickly and for larger amounts than under private ownership. That is very important to consider, that under national ownership and control, failing banks can be funded more quickly and for larger amounts than under private ownership. That's something that we must consider with regards to South Africa as well. Any failing banks, the failing banks in the last 10 years and all that. And, these failing banks, can be funded more quickly and for larger amounts, that's something that we must consider as well. And this enables the banking infrastructure to be rebuilt, as well as ensure the closer regulation of banks in the future. With regards to sociare and societas, this has to do with socialism in a way, socialism, it's all about state control, I think, state control. The emphasis of socialism is state control. So the reason why I bring this into the conversation is because of nationalization. It was nationalization, we're talking about state control. So there is an element of socialism, but I don't believe we need like full out socialism. There's a balance. There's a balance between private ownership and public or state-owned ownership. There is a balance, but there are certain matters where you need the state to come in. You need, for example, we need nationalization in our country. As we're going to break it down, the different aspects of our society, that we need to consider when we're talking about nationalization. So now, with regards to, I just want to maybe to add something a bit that will make you, think a bit, when you're talking about socialism. For Andrew Vincent, the word socialism finds its root in the Latin sociare, which means to combine or to share. The related and more technical term in Roman and then medieval law, societas. This latter word could mean companionship and fellowship. So that's something you need to consider about the term socialism. Maybe, for example, you must not just think about state control. You must also think about actually the term socialism itself is connected with meaning to combine or to share. So what does that have to do with nationalization? We're talking about sharing of wealth and that, where we're talking about sharing of the use of the country's resources with the with the poor and with the disadvantaged, because it's our land, it's our nation, it's our country. So that's I just wanted to add that to the conversation a bit. And then before I move on to the next section of this presentation, before we end off with what is nationalization, what is it all about? For me, I always open up a conversation, even those who are against nationalization. That's why, for example, I even cover even this part of the conversation. The disadvantage of nationalization where it was not implemented properly. So and now I talk about those disadvantages. The disadvantages of nationalization is that by the late 1970s, it became increasingly apparent that many of the industries nationalized between 1945 and 1951 were running into difficulties. The major problems that the industries faced were they were managed ineffectively and efficiently. That's a key point. I want you to note down that there's no point nationalizing and then but those institutions that are nationalized are not run effectively. So effective governance is key. Because there's no point, as I said, nationalizing, but there's no proper form of governance. The principal agent problem is highly relevant to public sector activities